All right. So what did you think of the apology? I'm dying to know. Now you have something you can brag about to all your fancy friends at your cocktail parties, and you can tell them, like, I've read Plato. I know what Socrates said in the face of death. And you can prove yourself to be a culturally literate person. Um, but if you have questions or shock of shocks, there was something in the apology that was very difficult to understand, maybe impossible to understand, or you have questions about something that's in the apology, you should blaze on over to our Canvas discussion board. And you'll see right here, I have a thread, questions and thoughts about the apology. And you should post your questions and thoughts there because we're interested in what you think. All right. So in these next couple of very short videos, I just want to highlight some things you want to make sure you remember and then give you some things that I want you to keep thinking about. All right, so our hero Socrates, the important point about Socrates is that he would talk to anyone, and he would talk to anyone because he didn't know who knew what and believed it was possible for anybody, regardless of their class and rank, it was possible for anybody to hold a piece of the truth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of weeks. Socrates was regarded as a teacher, and you can see this in the Apology, that he tries to distance himself and say, I am not a teacher. I'm a person who walks around and has conversations with people. I'm a person who walks around and asks questions. I don't purport to teach anyone anything because that would assume I know something, and I'm working from the assumption that I don't know something. And so I ask somebody who claims to know that something, what they know, and then we have this conversation, but I don't teach anybody anything. In fact, he even goes so far as to, whoops, that's not what you want. He even goes so far as to point to the fact that he's lived in poverty as evidence that he's not a teacher. It's like, look, if I were a teacher, I'd be getting paid to teach. And if I were getting paid to teach, I'd have money. And clearly all of you know from my entire life living here, I don't have a dime to my name. Now, one of the reasons this is important is because there were people who were teachers during Socrates' time, and they are oftentimes called the Sophists. And the Sophists were these folks who would travel around town to town, and they would lecture small groups of people or individual people for money. What bothered Socrates, one of the things that bothered Socrates about the Sophists, is that they operated from the assumption that there's no such thing as truth. There's only power and success. And so as a consequence, you should focus your time not on pursuing the kinds of questions that Socrates pursues, which are about truth. You should instead work on refining your speaking abilities, your ability to persuade people, study rhetoric, learn how to influence people by using words and arguments that will cause them to give you what you want, whether it's status or power or money. And again, Socrates was very bothered by this because for Socrates, the most important thing was the truth. An example of one of the Sophists is a fellow named Protagoras. And you can see here is a quote from one of the fragments that I mentioned earlier that we have from Protagoras' writings. It's a very famous one. And he says, man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not. So what Protagoras is saying here is that the individual person is what determines what exists, what doesn't exist. In other words, my world is entirely defined by my perspective, and I can never get outside of myself to know whether or not you experience red in the same way that I experience red. I don't know if pizza tastes the same way to you as it does to me, and I'll never know. So I am, as an individual, the sole judge of what is, because I can only determine what is in my world. So Protagoras is offering to us kind of radical relativism and positing that all is relative to human subjectivity. We sort of live in our own little worlds that we can't get unplugged from. And so Protagoras says, you should spend time learning about how the people you're living with think about things and try as hard as you can to kind of get into their heads and try to understand how they might see things so that they will help you be successful in that community. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things about Protagoras is his name. If you read a story like Huckleberry Finn, we would talk about Huck Finn as the protagonist. In other words, when we read Huckleberry Finn, we're sort of in the world of Huck. and we're watching things unfold from his perspective. We're not getting to see the world through Jim or any of the other characters in the story. We only get to see what Huck sees. And so that's why we call him the protagonist, because we're seeing his world. And that word protagonist comes from Protagoras. So again, just like we were saying, like, wow, we still talk about the Socratic method 2,500 years later. We still talk about protagonists. Okay, so you're seeing this kind of linkage between what people were thinking about and doing almost 3,000 years ago and what we continue to do today. And it's kind of awesome. All right. So what happened? As you know, Seraphim goes to the oracle at Delphi and says, who's the wisest? Like, who knows what's going on here? And Delphi says, the oracle says, it's Socrates. He's the man. He's the wise one. He's the wisest, coolest dude in all the land. And Seraphim goes and tells Socrates this, and Socrates is like, that's BS. I don't know. I'm not the wisest person. I don't even think I know anything. And I'm going to prove it. And I'm going to prove it by going around and talking to people who claim to know things. I'm going to go to this politician or this judge, and I'm going to ask them what justice is. Or I'm going to go to this artist, and I'm going to ask them, like, what's beauty? I'm going to go to the people who claim to have expertise or knowledge that they get social status from based on their claim to have this knowledge. And I'm going to ask them what these things are. And through a course of conversations, Socrates comes to realize they don't know anything. Even though they claim to, they really don't. Their ideas don't make sense. Usually they fall into some sort of self-contradiction. And so Socrates comes to the conclusion, like, well, geez, if I don't think I know anything, and it seems pretty clear to me they don't know anything, maybe the oracle was right. Maybe I am the wisest one, because at least I know I don't know. They think they know, but they clearly don't. And at least I'm wise enough to realize that I don't know. Okay, so this becomes, in this process, becomes a real problem for the authorities in Athens. They don't like what Socrates is doing. It seems to undermine their own credibility. And so they come together and they level charges against him. It's like, Socrates, we're not digging you because you make us feel very unsafe. You compromise, or you threaten our power. You threaten our social standing. And we need to figure out a way to remove you from our space that's a little safer without you. And it doesn't contain your dangerous ideas. So Miletus and some others bring some charges against Socrates. You're not worshiping the right gods. You're corrupting the youth. You can see these little banishment ballots down here. I always think these are interesting. And as I said earlier, Miletus is probably a religious fanatic, less concerned about him corrupting the youth, and more concerned about Socrates not thinking the right things in his mind about the legitimacy of the gods, the state-approved gods. What's important to note that's not mentioned, Socrates doesn't mention in his apology, is that, and we don't know this for sure, this is speculation, but Miletus was a poet. And as a poet, what poets would do is they would write the myths, right, that we talked about earlier. So they were responsible for sort of perpetuating the mythos and continuing this tradition that many of the pre-Socratics and Socrates were moving away from. And so Miletus probably felt very threatened by that, because it was compromising his own standing in his community as some sort of almost like a religious authority. All right, now here's something really interesting. Keep in mind. So the jury, there's 500 people. The jury comes back and they say, all right, Socrates, you're guilty. And the vote was 280 to 220. So one thing to think about is, wow, man, there were 220 people that thought that what Socrates had done was a crime. Right? That's kind of wild. But another thing to think about is this. So then you read, Socrates says, hey, here's a variety of punishments you could hand down to me. And here's what's wrong with all of them. What I think my punishment should be is I think you should shack me up in the hall where you keep all of the celebrated Olympians, where they live this life of luxury and eat great food, because I'm so awesome. And if you do anything else to me, if you banish me to another community, you're losing out. What he says is you're losing out on a gift God has given to you. Me. Like, I'm literally God's gift to you. And you saw some of the other arguments that he made about his uniqueness. The vote changed. when they decided on the punishment. So now they voted 360 in favor of death. So think about that. 220 voted to acquit. What Socrates said in his discussion of what his punishment should be pissed off some number of people so much that they just changed their minds from acquitting him to killing him. Right? So Socrates must have really been annoying to folks. So at any rate, take that away for what you will. In the next video, we'll talk about some things we want to continue to think about.